Let's get this sports podcast party started, all right?
The J Reels Podcast.
What is happening, my good people? Greetings. How are you? How's it going? How's everybody doing out there? What is the latest and greatest? Hope everybody's doing well, feeling fantastic, in excellent spirits. Summer is in its swan song, with fall making its way into our consciousness, and so is the latest podcast, detailing all that's happening in the world of sports. Is yours truly, as this is the J Reels Podcast with your host, J Reels. For my first timers, welcome aboard, and for those who've been banging with me going back to the very beginning, somewhere in the middle, or even as early as this past Thursday, I welcome you guys and gals back, and yes, 500 episodes, just a couple away, as we get close to that milestone. And at that time, of course, I'll sing the praises to all of you guys and gals that have followed me throughout this journey. Well more than 6.5 years. And as long as I'm alive and breathing, I'm going to continue to go as far as the good Lord will have me here on this beautiful green earth. But to put that aside, I wish I could start off with the baseball, but it's the same old when it comes to what's happening. And you know, there's going to be a lot to uncover there, especially with my beloved Mets, who had a rough weekend in Philadelphia, no matter how you slice it. But thankfully, the Dodgers were able to win a game last night in order for the Braves to not overtake the Mets for that final wildcard spot. But one more time, I will touch on that later on. I have to start off with the NFL because we have some intriguing storylines that have come out. And I get it. A lot of it could be an overreaction. This is what we do in the quote-unquote Monday morning quarterback, considering that it is Monday morning. But for the National Football League, to me, the overriding theme yesterday was, yes, I'm going to break down the 2-0 teams that I got off to surprising starts and then the 0-2 teams that have you a little bit puzzled. But it was the way that some of these teams that got to 2-0 because of shocking results, ones that I did not see coming. And the first one I have to start off with, because it was at home and because it was a rematch of last year's divisional round, although it could have been very dicey to think how Tampa played in that second round game against the Lions in last year's playoff. And a lot of people thought, could we get the same kind of back and forth, battle it out, maybe to the final possession between those two teams? Or will the Lions look back to last year and say, hey, maybe we fooled around a little bit. Maybe it was a little bit closer than what we would have liked. And obviously the stakes being much higher. But for yesterday, and part of it has to do with the coach, Dan Campbell, and I'll get to, but the Buccaneers, a surprising win in Detroit. And a lot of people could probably say, well, wait a minute, Tampa got off to a good start there against the Commanders, no big whoop. But for them to go on the road into Motown, and I'm sure maybe last year, maybe there was a bit of that bad taste in their mouths, the Buccaneers that is, knowing that their season ended in Detroit, and for them to win that game, obviously against a team that a lot of people think that could go to the Super Bowl, including hand raised high in the air, yours truly. But the Lions fell short, and give it up for Baker Mayfield. Not an astounding game, real paltry when you look at his numbers. What was he, 12 for 19, 185 yards? But Chris Godwin was a big factor there from the receiving standpoint, getting well over 100 yards. And let's go to Dan Campbell, because at the end of the first half, he screwed up the clock management where they could have kicked a field goal. That wasn't the case. And even though they lost by 4, and you could say, well, Jay Reels, that field goal wouldn't have mattered. But guess what? It would have, because then they could have marched down for the game-winning field goal there at the end at 2019. And I understand it's hypothetical, because what if they missed the kick there right before the half, even if everything worked out properly for the Lions? But as it was, Campbell admitted that it was his fault. He should have known better. And that's one thing you got to think about the Lions moving forward. We know they have talent. We know that they were this close to getting to a Super Bowl last year. But what was the one thing that stopped them from doing so? The coaching decisions, especially when it comes to the head coach. And for him to screw this up in a game in September, as the season moves along and you would think that the Lions are going to have this big season, all right, maybe it's neither here nor there. But this is the one thing that would worry me, Lion fans, and even for those who are rooting for the Lions from afar to finally get to a Super Bowl for the first time in that organization's history, and to know that the coach, as fiery and a guy that you want to go through a brick wall for, this is where you have to scratch your head, and you really have to wonder and be concerned whether or not in big moments, just like what we saw in the NFC Championship game, he went for it those 2 times. I get it. It's aggressive. I get it that this is the NFL. with the percentages and even with the analytics, more so that than the percentages. But this is the one thing that would scare me, because for the Lions to get where they want to go, not to say that he has to be Vince Lombardi or Bill Belichick for more recent vintage, but he does have to be a little bit wiser as far as clock management, as far as play calling, as far as instead of taking that risk. And I understand, no risk it, no biscuit, but you have to be a little bit more smarter as far as what you're going to do here when it comes to big time, crunch time decision making. And what you saw there yesterday, granted, it was in the first half. It wasn't anything that you saw in the second half, but it certainly hurt him to the point where the Buccaneers go in there and they start their season 2-0 and off to a great start. The other game, and Jared Goff did not have a good game either. He threw 55 times in the game, over 300 yards, but he had 2 interceptions and definitely did not play well for the Lions. Now, the second game that had me shocked was the Cowboys. And we know what happened there week 1 against the Browns, and maybe it was more of an indictment on Cleveland, and I'll get to them in a little while, than the Cowboy defense. But boy, what happened to Trayvon Diggs, to Micah Parsons, to Dexter Lawrence? They were looking like the last time that the Cowboys played in that building, that playoff game against the Packers where they gave up, 41 in the game? And here it was where the Saints, all right, good start for them, but they beat up on the lowly Carolina Panthers at home, but they just scored at will. And Derek Carr, who did not have a big game offensively, yes, he did throw a lot of touchdowns, but another paltry sum when you think about it. It wasn't as if he was 28 for 35 for 345 yards and 3 touchdowns. No, that was not the case. But it was Alvin Kamara coming out of the time machine 2017, 2018 in the heyday of that Saint offense, to where they got a bunch of possessions where they scored 35 points in the first half, and it almost looked like Drew Brees was at quarterback and Sean Payton was at the sideline. And for the Cowboys to just put up a stinker. And I get it, that could happen every now and again. But as we know, other than that playoff game that I mentioned and the loss to Green Bay, they had won 16 straight in their building. And here it was, the Saints came marching in and right through AT&T Stadium to where they won 44-19. Dak Prescott did not have a good game, and he's off to a pretty slow start in his own right. Considering the game in Cleveland, it's not as if he lit the scoreboard on fire. So now you have a scenario where, is the sky falling in Dallas? I know Stephen A, and I'm tired of that whole narrative and laughing or whatever. Please, I get it's for ratings, and I don't want to just pick on Stephen A, but I was shocked by that outcome, knowing that, could the Saints win on the road in Dallas? All right, if it was 27-24, I'd say, okay, wow, good job by the Saints. But the game was a blowout. The Cowboy defense did not show up, and the Saints, you may have to take seriously, because think about this. All right, lowly Carolina team, one thing. On the road in Dallas, that's another, and they put up 91 points here in the first 2 weeks of the season. Now, is this going to continue at a 44-point-a-game clip? Obviously, that's not going to be the case, but what a tremendous start by the Saints, another 2-0 team that we'll discuss later on to go along with their division foes and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And then the last one that was shocking was the Niners. Brock Purdy was under siege by that Viking defense, 6 sacks, he threw an interception, and they pretty much led throughout the whole game. Now, Justin Jefferson had to leave with a quad. Who knows what that's going to be like. And the Vikings, under Sam Darnold, of all quarterbacks, now get off to a 2-0 start. And the Vikings, who had beaten the Niners last year, if you recall, in the middle of the season, that was when the Niners had gone through that little funk. I believe they started off 5-0. They lost in Cleveland. Then they lost in Minnesota before losing that third game. Off the top of my head, it's eluding me right now. But that's when the Niners went through a little bit of a malaise after that 5-0 start. And now here they go back to the US Bank Stadium. I was going to say Metrodome at first. And they lose another game in back-to-back years. And for the Niners, I'm sure all will be well. But that was also a surprise. Granted that they had to go on the road. And the Vikings coming off of that Week 1 win against the Giants. Who would have thought that the Vikings would have come away with a victory? And they're now 2-0 to start off their season. And the Niners, I think they'll be fine, despite the fact that they're not going to have Christian McCaffrey. He has that calf/Achilles that's been bothering him, so he's going to be out for another 4 weeks on IR. And that's a significant loss, as we know, even though I think the Niners will be fine. But is he the guy that really, the straw that stirs the drink with that offense? You could probably say that, considering the Niners are not a good come-from-behind team. They have to play from in front. They have to be a team that everything has to be clicking. They're not a team that could rally from big-time deficits, although we have seen that in the past, but I think that's more of the fault of the other team, a la the Lions, as I just mentioned a little while ago, with their play calling and their coaching decisions. But give it up to the Vikings. Great start. Kudos to them. And are these going to be sustainable for those first three teams that I mentioned for those 2-0 starts? And to continue on that theme, with the significant beginnings for these type of ball clubs, I'll get to the Steelers later on. I'll save them for last. But they're also another team that's 2-0. And a lot of people are going to think, oh, please, they're frauds. And trust me, I will give you an objective, honest opinion when it comes to them, as I always have throughout the 6.5 years that I've been doing this podcast. The Chargers, another team that was looking for some high hopes considering they bring in Jim Harbaugh, and with a ho-hum win against the Raiders in their building last week, they go on the road, Carolina, and Carolina looks like a dead team walking already. And I'll talk more about them in the 0-2 segment. But for the Chargers, even with Justin Herbert, I believe had to leave with a leg injury, but he should be fine moving forward. And the Chargers are actually going to stay in the East Coast because they'll play Pittsburgh this Sunday in a matchup that looks a little bit more intriguing than we probably would have thought at the start of the season, which, again, it's only a couple weeks ago. But give it up for what the Chargers have done. They've been more than what anybody could imagine, considering the last few years on the Brandon Staley. It's been a disaster. And the Chargers, who have the talent there with the quarterback, and they've had to piecemeal it here over the last couple of years. They've had guys leave, the Keenan Allens, what that was a trade, Austin Eckler, Mike Williams. So they've had a pretty much revamped offense. But bringing in guys like J.K. Dobbins, who had that ACL injury last year and who did show some promise in Baltimore, but now looks like a guy 100% healthy, 17 carries, 131 yards yesterday. And this new look Charger team with obviously the new head coach, who knows? Maybe the Chargers could surprise some people there as we move it along. Now, the other 2-0 teams that come to no surprise, the Chiefs. And the Chiefs can really be 0-2 when you think about it, because yesterday they had the pass interference there late, which pretty much propelled them to win that game, 4th and 16. And I get it. It was a rookie mistake by the corner, Dijon Anthony, and that turned the fortunes of that game around to where Harrison Butker kicks a 51-yard field goal at the buzzer. But Patrick Mahomes, not impressive to say the least, only 151 yards, threw a couple of interceptions, one by Cam Taylor-Britt, which was a highlight reel, to say the least. And I'll talk about the Bengals in a minute because they're the 0-2 teams that we'll discuss. But for the Chiefs, they could be 0-2 considering what happened there in the opening game of the season, where they could have probably lost the game. It certainly could have been an opportunity for them to tie on that terrible pass by Lamar Jackson, who overthrew Zay Flowers in the end zone. And then the next pass was Isaiah Likely back of the end zone. But his toe on, I don't know what size shoe he wears, 13, 14, whatever it is, did touch the back of the end zone, the white there. And that's what happens when you're a team led by Patrick Mahomes and, of course, the head coach Andy Reid. They're going to win these type of games. And for whatever the reason, the horseshoe seems to be in their locker room, because generally for a team that's had so much success here over the last half a decade, to where they won 3 Super Bowls and gone to 4, and for them to come out of that with that type of win, knowing that they did not play well throughout the course of the day. They had Isaiah Pacheco go out. They're bringing in guys that you never even heard of. Carson Steele, who? And they somehow, some way find a way. Travis Kelce, 1 catch for 5 yards. I get it. He's starting to get down on the other side of the mountain where he'll probably have his moments, and he's going to be the type of guy where when they absolutely 100% positively need him, that's when they're going to go to the casing on the side of the wall in the hospital or the school, break with the, the emergency, break it with the glass or whatever, you know what I'm saying. I got my analogies all mixed up here. Break glass for an emergency. All right, let's get it together, J-Reels. So that's when Kelce's going to be needed, because other than that, I don't think he's going to be a factor in these games. Xavier Worthy, a guy that obviously could be more of a decoy than anything. Rashee Rice, he'll give you the 1 touchdown a game, or he'll give you the 1 big play. But this isn't a high-octane, powerful Chief offense that we've come to know and love. But the thing is that when you have number 15 under center, and all he needs to do is just make 1 critical key play at any given point of the game, and that's all you need. And the Chiefs are 2-0. as of right this moment. Same for the Bills. Also 2-0. No surprise. They go down to Miami Thursday night, and we understand the big story is Tua Tagovailoa, which I'll get to. But for James Cook, who's gotten off to a great start out of the backfield for the Bills, and without Gabe Davis and without Stephon Diggs, here are the Bills. Now, they had to fight tooth and nail in the opening game against Arizona. Maybe they're a little bit better than what we think, considering what happened there yesterday in the desert against the Rams. And we'll get to the Rams, too, one of those 0-2 teams. But for the Bills, they look like they're going to be formidable. They look like they're going to be a team that, yeah, they may have their moments throughout the year where you're going to question them, but right now you cannot do that. 2-0, leading the AFC East off to a flying start. Another team that may come as a little bit of a surprise are the Seahawks. And I thought that they'd be a bit of a surprise in their own right, considering it was a loaded, and I say was right now because of what the Rams have done over the first 2 weeks. But the Niners, now 1-1. Arizona's showing that they're a little bit feisty, and the Rams now 0-2. But guess what? Seattle at the very top. Beating New England yesterday, Seattle, that is, to where Geno Smith had a big game, and it's weird. Geno Smith will give you those type of games where his stats jump off the page, and it makes you think like, wait a minute, Geno Smith, this is what's happening here? And he's had his moments there in a Seahawk uniform. I mean, the guy's been in the league for how long? Jets, Giants, now with a home in Seattle, and he has actually played pretty well. Probably a lot more better than a lot of people think. And for Geno Smith yesterday, having to go on the road, fly West Coast to East Coast, put up 327 yards, only one touchdown, but threw 33 for 44, which if you do the math, that's 75%. And I understand a lot of those are of the intermediate variety, although he did get the big touchdown to DK Metcalf where he was just wide open, just a breakdown in the secondary by the Patriots. But they were able to outlast the Patriots at home after that win in Cincinnati, to where the Seahawks are now 2-0. And do you believe in them to make some noise throughout the course of this regular season, especially in that division with the reigning NFC champs? That we'll have to wait and see. Do I think so deep down in the gut? I have to say no, but you do have Seattle right now at 2-0. And then last night you had Houston against the Bears, which I think the game just ended 5 minutes ago. That game was just interminable. I didn't really watch, but I did saw the tail end, and just to know that it was almost 11:45, and it was, I believe, a minute and change to go in the game. That's all you need to know about the game itself. I didn't stick with it. And for the Texans, who are going to have a good team, I thought maybe they would take a step back, considering that they were going to be more the hunted than the huntee. But granted, 2 wins under their belt. I get it. It's the Colts and the Bears. And Caleb Williams was running for his life there yesterday because the offensive line is not great, and they're going to need to address that in the offseason. But the Texans, give it up. And here's one thing about the Texans I will say. As good as they've been here with the D'Amico Ryans and C.J. Stroud, I want to see them play better competition, because Indianapolis, who was just awful against Green Bay yesterday, and Anthony Richardson, as we've seen, he is still a raw quarterback. And then the Bears, again, rookie quarterback in their own right. I need to see them play stiffer competition. Now, the division looks like they're going to run away with it because they already have a 2-game lead over everybody. Because Jacksonville's been a major disappointment. They're off to an 0-2 start. Tennessee, where Will Levis, he's trying to create ways on offense to lose games, as they did so yesterday. And then when you also look at the Colts, as I mentioned, those are 3 teams that could be out of it by the time you get to Halloween. So let me see them play better competition. They're going to have a few more primetime games on the schedule. So that's what we have with Houston. And you do have the Eagles tonight. Monday night, they're 1-0, but they could go 2-0. And if that's the case, you could have an 0-2 team with the Falcons, the team that they play, which I'll get to later on. Now, the flip side, the 0-2 teams. And when we look at just from the periphery of the last 3 years, where we've expanded the playoffs to 7 teams. So it's including one more extra team than we've seen here, obviously, prior to the 2021 season. So for these teams that have played in the regular season that started off 0-2, only 3 teams have made the playoffs. I get it, a very small sample size, but when you look at least 3 of the teams, maybe 4 if you want to include the Rams, that have gotten off to very surprising starts, the first ones have to be Baltimore, because the Ravens, who obviously were this close to making it to the Super Bowl last year, if it wasn't for Zay Flowers fumbling at the goal line, and then the interception on the next drive by Lamar Jackson. But for the Ravens, and a shocker in its own right, because the Raiders, who would have thought that after just a putrid game on the road in LA against the Chargers, now had to go face the Ravens after losing that tough game in Kansas City. I thought that this was going to be 35-9 for the Ravens to just run up and down the field on the Raiders. And I get it that the Raiders have a decent defense, but here's what you need to know. They were up by 10 points in the third quarter, and then Lamar throws a pick to where that turned into a touchdown. And then the next thing you know, 23-13 in the third quarter. And as we all know, the Ravens are a front-running team. They want to play from in front. They want to run the clock out. They want to use, obviously, Lamar Jackson with his legs to try to keep the chains moving and to keep the clock ticking, as well as Derrick Henry, 18 carries, 84 yards, productive. But for whatever the reason, they were unable to hold on to a lead led by Gardner Minshew on the other side. And not to knock Gardner Minshew, because he's had his moments in the league, whether it's in Jacksonville, Philadelphia, not so much, but still a guy that when he comes in a pinch hitting role could come up with a big hit or even a home run. And yesterday, you have to admit, that was a home run for the Raiders because they've had their first two games on the road. They go back home knowing that they were able to get one of the two, especially against one of the finalists in the AFC in last year's season. And now Baltimore's, to me, is in disarray. Because for Lamar Jackson, not off to a good start in his season, and you have to wonder what's going on with that defense. And granted that they've lost some pieces in the offseason, and I don't want to hear it anymore about Marlon Humphrey. Here's a guy that I get it. He can have all the All-Pro and Pro Bowl nods left and right, but every time I watch this guy, he's getting picked apart. And on that final drive to where they kicked the field goal, I believe it was a 3rd and 9, what was the completion on? Marlon Humphrey. Just like last year against the Rams when they came back from that game. I mean, I could go through all the games. Last year in the Steeler game, week 5, who's getting behind him deep on the right sideline? George Pickens for the game-winning touchdown? Marlon Humphrey. The guy's getting torched left and right. So I don't want to hear anything about this guy. Oh, he's one of the top corners in the league. Oh, he's one of the top-paid guys. Yeah, he can be top-paid all he wants, but the guy in big spots always holds. So if you're a Raven fan, you have to be concerned about this start. Granted, it's 2 games. I understand we can look at the skies falling, the overreaction, etc. There's still 15 games to go. But if you're a Raven fan, you cannot be happy by what you've seen here, especially yesterday, blowing a 10-point lead at home where you usually dominate. And then the other 0-2 team, we touched on a little bit with Kansas City, are the Bengals. Now, we can look at that fumble, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to argue whether or not the fumble by Joe Burrow getting sacked where it was recovered by, was it Chamari Carter? I don't even know the guy's name off the top of my head. But that was a fumble that you had to see from a million different angles. And it was one that, at first, I'm thinking, how is that a fumble? Because it was almost when Burrow got sacked, it seemed like the ball popped out 10 minutes later. And then I thought to myself, no, they're going to call this back. There's no way that this should have been a fumble. But as you see the replays, and you had to see it pretty much on the last replay, because based on when Burrow, as he was being thrown to the ground, that's when the ball started to squib and started to get loose to where it did fall out, and then it popped up out of nowhere before it was recovered there. And yes, I said Carter, my bad. It's Shamari Connor. So my apologies to him. But with that fumble recovery at 22-17, and then for the big play, which I talked about, at 25-23, 4th and 16. And like I said, Mahomes did not have a good game. And then what happens? As he scrambles, he goes right, throws across his body, does find a receiver, but then the rookie cornerback bumps him, and that's a call that you have to make. So I can see the Bengal fan being up in arms like, oh, come on, how can you make that call? Come on. Even if that was Deion Sanders, you still have to throw the flag there. And that's set them up for the 51-yard field goal. And the Bengals, another slow start. Last year they were 0-2, if you remember. They just laid a big giant deuce in Cleveland before losing at Baltimore, or losing to Baltimore at home. And now another 0-2 start. And I attribute all these bad starts and slow offensive numbers and all these things, which I'll get to in a second. To me, it's because of the lack of cohesion during preseason. These teams get off to these sluggish starts, and therefore you see just bad offensive outputs. Yes, you can maybe even credit the defense to a certain extent, but look what's happened here between Baltimore, the Bengals, and then the next team on the schedule, on the docket, are the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're also 0-2. Could have won in Miami. That didn't happen. And then yesterday, they were just pathetic to where the Browns were 2 for 14 on third downs, number one. Deshaun Watson did not, although look better, but he didn't light the world on fire with his offensive numbers. And then they had so many chances at first and goal that they ended up going backwards to the point where Trevor Lawrence looks lost. And when we thought a couple of years ago with the marriage of Doug Peterson to that organization and to the quarterback, as we know, won a Super Bowl there in Philly with Nick Foles of all quarterbacks, and for them to make the playoffs down 27-0 to the Chargers. They came back. They actually played pretty well against Kansas City before losing, and since then they have nosedived. And now they're 0-2. And you have to wonder what the hell's going on there with the Jaguars, because this should have been a team on the rise. Trevor Lawrence, a former number 1 overall, where a lot of people thought that he was going to be the next face of the league, or at least a guy that was going to be competing not only just for division titles, but maybe getting chances in championship games and maybe Super Bowls. And granted that his career is still very young, but they have just been awful to start off their year. And now they're 0-2, and you have to wonder whether or not they're going to be able to turn their season around. And just when you think that, all right, well, who do they have next on the schedule? Maybe they have a cupcake. No, they got to go to Buffalo on a Monday night. So it looks like they could be facing 0-3. And just like I mentioned, teams that are 0-2 in this relatively short span of teams that have gotten off to 0-2 starts, not making the playoffs, and then you have Jacksonville. So that's another team that we have to discuss. And then the Rams, I understand between Cooper Kupp now hurt yesterday, and who knows what his scenario is going to be, and with Puka Nacua on IR, and Matthew Stafford had nobody to throw it to, and losing 41-10 yesterday in the desert to the Cardinals. Certainly not the start that they wanted. And remember, last year this team started off 3-6 and made it to the playoffs. So I'm not going to throw dirt on them just yet. But another team that you have to wonder in a division that looks like it's going to be pretty feisty, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. We know what Seattle's done so far. Arizona, maybe a little bit better than we thought. Could we even say that? And the Niners are the Niners. So it's going to be uphill for them. And I believe they have the 49ers on deck, where let's see if the Rams are going to be able to get off the snide and get a win in their column, because they're going to need one quick, fast, in a hurry. And mind you, that game's going to be in LA because the Rams started their first 2 games on the road, obviously at Detroit last week and then yesterday against Arizona. And then the other teams to round it out, the Giants, do I even need to get into them? Here's all you need to know about the Giants. The Giants lost 21-18, and you would think, all right, well, maybe they gave up a last-second touchdown, whatever. 7 field goals. But here's the thing that has to pull your hair out of your head if you're a Giant fan. Brian Daboll, I don't know what he's thinking, and granted, I think the bloom is off that rose, if you ask me, because the Giants usually do well against Commanders, especially Daniel Jones. But what is he doing at 12-9 and at 18-15 trying to go for 2? If it's 12-9, kick the extra point, and then you have a scenario, and I didn't watch this game fully, so I don't know if the kicker was out. As a matter of fact, let me pull that up real quick, because I want to make sure, that I'm getting this correct. Because just to make sure that I'm on the same page, yeah, now they had a bunch of, well, I guess when you look at it, they have Jamie Gillen. Maybe they didn't want to use him as the kicker because Graham Gano was their normal kicker, and I guess they probably just wanted to go for 2, which I understand. If you're not going to trust your kicker to kick an extra point, but you got to give him at least a second chance. Because how is it that you're just going to continue to go for 2 where all you need is 1 point? And if they would have gotten the 1 point out of those 2 scenarios, again, 12-9 and 18-15, you win the game. So I don't want to hear about, well, I didn't have my kicker or whatever. And all right, you have a built-in excuse. Understood. But even after the first one, could you try? Unless that first attempt, and I didn't watch the game like I said, unless that first attempt, he kicked it to Virginia. So I don't want to hear that you could at least give this guy one more shot. And if he shanks it badly or what have you, then you could go for 2 on that third attempt. But that was just a terrible job, I thought, in my eyes, and just watching it from afar and getting a breakdown of what was going on with the Giants. So, and I got to find out what happened to Gano in this game. And again, I should look at that. But when I saw the box score and I'm trying to put everything together and try to come up with what's going on here as far as how did the Commanders kick 7 field goals and win the game 21-18. And then I look at the Giants and what they've done. And obviously with the extra point scenario and them having to go for two in those two times, I said, wait a second. Yes, Graham Gano opening kickoff. I see they lost him due to an injury. All right, so they had to use the punter to convert those extra points. And the first one I didn't see, but still, give it another shot after the second touchdown. And if that doesn't work, then all right, you got to go for two. I totally get it. But not after missing the first one. So anyway, the Giants look like they're going to have a long year, and that was just a brutal game for them to lose as a last-second field goal dooms them. And then you have the Broncos. What more can you say? I'll get to the Steelers after I go through this segment and then wrap up with a few games here, as I'm already a half hour into this. But for the Broncos, Bo Nix, not a great game for him yesterday. Threw a terrible pick in the end zone there as they looked like they were about to get themselves in the game. And the Steelers capitalized. And their defense, they were phenomenal. And I get it. It was against a rookie quarterback, so you can't go crazy considering the final score was 13-6. And everybody could go nuts. And I'll get into them more at the end of the football segment about the Steelers and what they've done defensively. They've only given up 16 points in the two games. Do the math, 8 points a game. But we got to pump the brakes on who they've played here so far. All right, the Falcons, all right, fine, no problem. But again, preseason, not in sync, etc. So I'll just leave it at that for now. But Denver, they look like they could have a long year. And even though Bo Nix could be their guy long term, but I'm sure Sean Payton, the coloring in his hair is probably going from that dirty brown blonde to white or gray in an instant. So they're off to a very slow start. And Carolina, I don't know what more else to say about this organization. They've scored 13 points in the first two games. Bryce Young had to be pulled. Another just pathetic game from him. And David Tepper, the owner, a lot of people think that they passed on the Texan quarterback, C.J. Stroud, and I think it would have been the same result. Maybe Stroud is a little bit better than Young, despite the fact that Young, coming from Alabama, big-time program, as we all know, but he has shown nothing in these 2 years. And I get it that Carolina doesn't have much overall. Offensive line being pieced together with Scotch tape and bubblegum. And when you look at their skill position players, they lost arguably their best defensive player in the one Derek Brown last year to, I believe, could be season ending. So you don't have a lot to work with there if you're in Carolina, but boy, they could be, and I know a lot of people are looking at them as the Chicago White Sox of the NFL, which obviously is not the type of term you want to be put here just 2 games into the 2024 season. But that's what we've seen so far. And Carolina, it looks like, could they be headed for an 0-17 season? I think they'll eke out a win somewhere along the line, but boy, it is very tough to even muster up. If you're scoring 13 points in the first 2 games, how are you going to even outlast another bad team in the league? So that's what you have there. And all right, let me get to Pittsburgh. I guess now's a good time as well as any, because we're talking about the 2-0 teams, and I got to go back to that, and then I'll wrap up what's happening throughout the league. I'm happy with what's happened. As the coach Mike Tomlin loves to say, you don't win on style points. And we know what the formula is for this team. This is for Justin Fields to not cause any turnovers, and he had another fumble there late, which could have been costly, but it wasn't there in the fourth quarter. But Justin Fields finally got him into the end zone on a touchdown to Darnell Washington, the tight end. Nice drive there, 12 plays, 75 yards. But nothing else after that. 2 field goals. I was thinking it was 10-0. 2 field goals to boot. Second half, they were invisible. They did absolutely zilch. And this is what the formula is going to be. For him to not make mistakes, and he's going to be the starter as long as he doesn't get hurt or just implodes. And I know Russell Wilson is probably chomping at the bit, etc. He got a petty game ball yesterday because his first time back in Denver since he got released, etc. Not so much fanfare, of course, because he didn't play in the game, but it's going to be Fields, don't make a mistake, manage the game, and let the defense win. And that's what you saw in week 1 against the Falcons, and that's what you saw week 2 against Denver. So I don't want to hear for any other Steeler fan, or hey, Jay Reels, great start by your guys. You got the Chargers coming in. That's going to be a bit more of a test, which I'm looking forward to seeing. But I'm not about to call this version of the 2024 Steeler defense anything close to a steel curtain, or Blitzburg in the 90s, or even the Super Bowl teams led by Troy Polamalu, James Harrison, etc. Not just yet. They have the talent, as we know, but let me see them play a better team. And we're going to see that as we move it along here, especially when we get to the second half of the year. But you got to be happy with their start. And as I mentioned 2.5 weeks ago in my preseason preview, they're going to have to at least get off to a 6-3 start because those last 8 games are all against the division, Kansas City and Philadelphia. And that's where they're going to have to separate, maybe at that point, 6-3 to go 10-7 if they go 4-4. 5-2 if you're lucky. So I'm just going to leave it right there. But Steeler offense, it's from hunger. It sets the NFL back 50 years. But if you win the game, that's all that matters. And that's all I care. They can win these games 3-2 as long as they win. But I'm not going to say smoke and mirrors as of yet. But I'm not also going to be puffing my chest out and think like, oh yeah, we're going to be right there at the end with the Kansas Cities, with the, dare I even say, Baltimore's, teams like that. Not ready to do that just yet, despite the fact that they have a 2-game lead over both Baltimore and Cincinnati. But that's what we have there with the 2-0 teams and the 0-2 teams. And to round out the rest of the schedule there yesterday, which I pretty much touched on all the games, and I know I want to move on to the baseball and even the college football, which there's a lot to even discuss there. But for the remainder of the schedule, I know Indianapolis, Green Bay, what is there to discuss? Malik Willis, listen, he won the game. They threw short passes, but Anthony Richardson, to me, is more of the story. Threw 3 interceptions, did not have a good game. And Josh Jacobs ran roughshod. That was the reason why they won, 151 yards on the ground as Green Bay wins against the Colts. Jets, I got to bring them up. They beat Tennessee. A little dicey at first, but Will Levis, another week where he also did not play well and was trying to lateral and do all these crazy things. But the Jets get a win under their belt and one that they needed in the worst way, because if they would have lost that game, they would have gone to 0-2. And then on a short week against New England Thursday night in their first home game, that could have been dicey. But for Aaron Rodgers, numbers didn't jump off the page. It's not as if he had a vintage Aaron Rodgers game, but again, in the pocket, made some big throws. And then you had the young kid, the youngest guy in the sport, in a one, Braylon Allen, contributing with a touchdown in the 20-year gap between the quarterback and the running back. And, hey, again, no style points. You don't worry about those as the Jets win in Tennessee. But besides that, I think I touched on all the games. Yeah, Cleveland, Jacksonville. What is there to discuss? I know Cleveland. To me, that's more indictment on Jacksonville than Cleveland. And, yeah, that pretty much covers all the games there. Seattle, New England, the Giants, Chargers, Vegas, Baltimore. Yeah, that pretty much does it. And tonight, Atlanta, Philadelphia. I think Philly will win tonight. Atlanta, kind of a must win. And the reason why I say that is because they are also, could be staring at 0-2. And they're looking up in the division to 2 teams that are 2-0 in New Orleans and Tampa. And who's coming to town next week if they go 0-2? The Kansas City Chiefs. Keep that in mind as we move it along. But besides that, that's what we have there in the NFL for this week. No other key injuries to report. Yes, I didn't mention Aiden Hutchinson, which I'm sure Baker Mayfield, even though the flight home was nice, but he probably had nightmares because Hutchinson had 4.5 sacks, and even that wasn't enough for Detroit to win. So that's all you need to know there. So that's it with the NFL. Let me pivot and now get into what's happening in college. Now, you had some games on the schedule that I talked about on Thursday where, yeah, they may not have been sexy or they may not have been to the point where, ooh, I got to really tune in or zero in on these matchups or what have you. A couple of rivalry games when it comes to in-state. But the one game that really, I don't want to say is going to stick with you, but something that you just got to keep in mind. Georgia is lucky to get out of Kentucky, rhyme there, for a 13-12 win where they literally had to hang on to win the game. And granted, they were down 9-3 in the game, and they were, one more time, had to sweat this one out. And good teams usually do that. And Kirby Smart even mentioned that in the postgame. He said, hey, listen, we were in a rock fight. We knew that this wasn't going to be an easy game. And remember, last year, Georgia had the same game like that against Missouri. I get it. Much more stiffer competition, but they were lucky to get out of that game alive when they went to Mizzou. And to me, this was a little bit similar, although earlier in the season for Clemson, and I don't know if they took Kentucky lightly. I don't know if Kentucky was that just pumped up and ready to go against the Bulldogs, but is this a bad thing considering that it's only week 3 and they still have Texas on the schedule and they still have Alabama and they still have just a road trip where a lot of these teams, you have to wonder whether or not they're going to be up to play against them, and especially stiffer competition with Alabama coming not this week, the following, and then you have Texas on the horizon. But for Georgia, was this a bad thing that they looked a little frenetic and had to literally scratch, claw to get out with a win? I think more of it is a good thing, because knowing that Alabama's in 2 weeks, and I don't know if they were looking ahead. I don't know if they just thought that, we could just go out there and just beat up on the Wildcats and that's it. Now, I would say it's a good thing, but because it's early in the year and because they have those 3 road games, which look like they could be very dicey, and as of right now, considering what Texas did, and mind you, they beat up on Texas of San Antonio, but the polls right now are showing as Texas is the number 1 team based on what we saw there in Kentucky, where Georgia now slipped to 2, and you'll get a better sense once the rankings come out in the middle of the week where everything falls, especially amongst the top 3 or 4 in the country. But that was one where I thought it was a good thing to kind of get it out now, because this will refocus, maybe even to a certain extent, re-energize this Bulldog team, knowing that on the road, where it's going to be a hostile environment in Tuscaloosa, where it's going to be a hostile environment there in Texas when they're going to go up against a Longhorn team, and that's going to be one where, I'm sure game day is going to be there. That is one, and I'm going to pull up when they play. I believe it's in the middle of October. I want to say the 17th, off the top, or maybe the 19th. Stand by as I pull that up. But let me tell you, that was one where if you're the Bulldogs, you were just lucky to just get out of that game alive. And let's see, Texas is on the 19th, like I mentioned. They go to Alabama there on the 28th, which that's a primetime game. The Texas game, I'm sure that may end up being a primetime game. And then they do have to go to Ole Miss. That was the other team I was thinking of, that they have to go on the road, which could be a little bit dicey. So that's why I think this win was big, because then now they do have to bye, and then they could focus in on Alabama. So it kind of lets them exhale, regroup, and now they'll have to go to Alabama and see where they stack up against them there 2 weeks from this past Saturday. And then when we talk about the Texas Ball Club, they won 56-7 against the University of Texas San Antonio. But the storyline coming out of this one, Quinn Ewers had to lead the game in the second quarter with an oblique strain, so in comes Arch Manning. Yes, the son of Cooper Manning, more famously known by his brothers Eli and Peyton, who are the uncles of a one Arch Manning. And all he did was throw for 223 yards, throw for 4 touchdowns, and ran for 1, which was 67 yards. Now, granted, the opponent were the Roadrunners, and certainly they are not the Roadrunner from the Looney Tunes cartoons back in the day. This is a Roadrunner team that you probably couldn't pick out of a lineup, which I know I wouldn't be able to. And you probably throw me under center for Texas, and maybe I won't throw for 4 touchdowns and run for a 67-yarder, but maybe I will contribute something to that offense considering the competition. But Arch Manning, the future of Longhorn football, you got a little bit of a taste there, and who knows how long Ewers is going to be out of the lineup. And you would think he'll be back in a month with that big-time matchup against Georgia to come. But they did well, and the only reason why I bring that up is because Arch Manning. But the games that I mentioned as far as having that, maybe not the sex appeal, but one to keep an eye on, as far as those rivalry games in-state, Oregon, they blew out Oregon State in the second half, and I'm sure the Beavers were game to do whatever they could to throw a wrench into the Duck system. And the game was close. It was 22-14 at the half, but then they go running away there in the second half. 49-14 wasn't even the game. So that was one that didn't even come down to the wire or even into the second half with any type of competitive juice. Same for Utah and Utah State. No Cam Rising. No problem as Isaac Wilson throws for 3 touchdowns, 239 yards as they win at Utah State 38-21. So no surprise there by the Utes winning there on the road. And then the other games, Notre Dame, who had that just embarrassing performance against Northern Illinois in their building. They go to Purdue, and what do? They smacked them 66-7. Nothing to discuss there. Speaking of Mizzou, the Tigers, they had to fight off the Eagles, who were game. They win 27-21 at home. Although they did play from in front, but certainly had to fight a little bit, especially in that first half where the Boston College team got off to a pretty good start, actually led in the second quarter, but then Mizzou took off from there. And even though they had to fend off the Eagles in the second half, but they pretty much went comfortably 27-21. LSU was the other game that was a little bit tricky. They were down 24-10 in the first half, but then they came storming back and actually took the lead late with a minute 12 to go before the Gamecocks looked like they're going to have a last-ditch attempt at a 49-yard field goal, and it was missed as time expired, so they couldn't push it into overtime. So LSU escapes with a 36-33 game. So South Carolina certainly were game in trying to do whatever it took to upset the Tigers there on the road, but that wasn't the case, or at home, I should say, where the Tigers were on the road. So LSU hangs on there, Brian Kelly and company, as they win that game. Speaking of Alabama, I know I talked about them with the whole game against Georgia in a couple of weeks. Alabama, Wisconsin, they were no match for the Crimson Tide. 42-10, even the quarterback there, Tyler Van Dyke, had to leave with what looked like a knee injury. So when you have your top quarterback, even with him in the lineup, they still wouldn't have beaten Alabama. But with him out of the lineup, you knew that was going to be tough sledding for the Badgers. And that's pretty much it with the big games this week. I know Florida State, you want to throw them out completely. They lose to Memphis at home. And I understand you lose the opening game there in Dublin. All right, weren't in sync. You could blame the travel, whatever, to Georgia Tech, fine. But then you lose to Boston College at home on Labor Day evening, and then you think, all right, well, we lost at home. Who knows? We didn't regroup in time or whatever. And then you have a bye, and then you come back with this performance here on Saturday against Memphis. Terrible job. So you can say goodbye to Florida State, and just shows how much they were frauds. And who knows? Maybe with Jordan Travis out, and that was bad. That could be even fireable when it comes to the head coach there and the one, Mike Norvell. So that'll do it with the college football. Now let me get into the batter's box and crank it out here where it comes to Major League Baseball. And here's what you have, people. This is, to me, the same song and dance that I've discussed here over the last probably 3 weeks. And here we are now past September 15th. Today, now, we're less than 2 weeks away. We'll put it this way. 2 weeks from today, the season's over. And 2 weeks from yesterday will be the conclusion of the Major League Baseball season. And what we have here is pretty much status quo, as I've discussed, like I mentioned, the last few weeks. And I didn't think that we were going to have much of a pennant race here over the last couple of weeks. Now, it's good that we have something to at least sink our teeth into. It's not as if the cupboard is completely bare. But what you have here is this. And I'll start with who else? My beloved Mets. Friday night, they blast Aaron Nola, who's pitched well against the Mets here over the last year or so, but they finally got his number. They put up 3-run homers left and right, whether your name is Brandon Nimmo, and even later on with Harrison Bader, but that was already when it was garbage time. But for the Mets to just get off the deck and win in Philly the way they did, 11-3, to start off that series, and there was a part of me that thought in the back of my mind, I said to myself, save some of these runs for the weekend, because how I looked at it is that when you have a big win like that to start off a series against, obviously, the NL East leading Phillies, I thought to myself, I don't know if this is going to bode well, to the point where they were going to go ahead, dare I even say sweep, or even win 2 out of 3. And for the Mets to just come out flying the way they did, with the 3-run homers, Francisco Alvarez started off the whole brigade in the 5th inning, and that's when the game broke open, because he had a 3-run homer, and then later on in the inning, Brandon Nimmo topped it off with his own 3-run homer, and pretty much the game was over from that point on. But then Saturday, they get off to a 4-0 lead there in the first 3 innings of the game, and you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, is this really going more than what we could ever expect? But then you had the scenario with Francisco Lindor, where he got to second base, and he tweaked something in his back, to where he was tagged out there, he overran the base, and for Lindor to now suffer this back injury. And now is at a point where you have to wonder whether or not, actually this was Friday night, so it was a thing where as Lindor is playing on an MVP clip, we talked about this a lot on Thursday's podcast, and then you bring in Luis Angel Acuna, who got his first Major League hit and was 2 for 4 there on Saturday, where Lindor was not in the lineup. And although he played yesterday but had to be pulled again, Now you have to wonder whether or not you're going to have your MVP here down the stretch. I believe he's going for an MRI this morning. Who knows what the outcome of that is as of right this moment. But you hold your bated breath, fans, to make sure that he's going to be okay. And even if he's not okay and he's nursing a back injury, it's not as if he has an ankle that's just nagging, or maybe it's an arm injury or shoulder. And we know shoulders are tricky, especially when you get in the batter's box, depending on the front shoulder. And we know he's a switch hitter, so that helps. But backs, you can wake up one day and feel great. And then the next thing you do, and remember, he ran out of the box there on Sunday, yesterday, to where he felt it. He said swinging, he was fine. But running, didn't work for him. So now we're going to have to worry for the rest of this year if this back is going to crop up, if this is going to really put a crimp on this season. Because now we're down to the final 2 weeks where the Nationals come in, and hopefully the Mets could do some damage against them before the Phillies come to town for 4 games. And with the Mets losing there on Saturday, let's get back to that. They go 4-0 in the game, and then they come back, Bryce Harper, and they come back with some key home runs in big spots. They win 6-4 there on Saturday. Again, after a 4-0 lead, and you understand Harper homer twice, that is, and then you had the 2 big runs there late, where the Phillies then overtook the Mets there in the latter part of the game, because although Harper homered with a solo shot in the 4th, he did add that 2-run homer in the 6th before the lead slipped away where they lost 6-4. And then yesterday, it was a pitcher's duel. Dave Peterson, as we all know, has been pitching well, throwing up zeros. And to go along with what had happened there with the other matchup, and you also had, I even forgot who started the game for the Phillies. My apologies here as I'm drawing blanks. As I pull that up, yes, Christopher Sanchez. He pitched very well, and when you thought that Tyrone Taylor hit that home run there, top of the 8th, you're thinking to yourself, oh man, if the Mets could just hang on, get out of Philly with 2 out of 3, and with the Braves holding court where they won the first 2 games against the Dodgers, and now that they drew even when it comes to the standings there for the final wild card spot. But then what happens? Bottom of the 8th, and yeah, sorry to say, this Met bullpen implodes at the wrong time. Now, I get it. Peterson started off the inning. Maybe started to run out of gas. He did throw 99 pitches. But Phil Maton tries to come in there and clean up the mess. But then, of course, Edwin Diaz, in a tie game, 9th inning, JT Realmuto walks it off there as the Mets lose 2-1 and lose the back 2 of that series. And all you could say is that a series which started off so promising. The Lindor injury, maybe that was an omen, a sign of things to come, even with the 4-0 lead there on Saturday. But now the Mets, and thankfully that the Dodgers showed up in Atlanta, which they'll play again tonight, and hopefully the Mets could win against the Nationals, and the Dodgers could at least split the 4-game series as they lost the first 2 games in Atlanta. And then maybe the Mets can get that 1-game lead, because as I said on Thursday, and I'll say it again, if the Mets are in a flat-footed tie a week from tomorrow, or you can say a week from today when we're on the podcast, but Mets-Braves will be next Tuesday. They cannot be a game behind. If they are a game behind, do you live with it? At this point of the season, considering that you've been neck and neck, you've been tied, or maybe a game up in the standings, you won't settle for anything less than at least being even. But if you're a game behind because of the competition in the schedule, the Mets have to sweep the Nationals this week. No ifs, ands, buts, babies about it. They have to. Now, if they win 2 out of 3, will you live with it? Yeah, I guess you have to live with it. Anything less than that, you can't. But we need a sweep here. Because with the Phillies coming to town, you can't expect to win 3 out of 4, and maybe you want to exact some revenge. All right, fine. But the Braves, after tonight against LA, to go to Cincinnati for 3. Who knows? What Cincinnati team? Are they going to be a team that's like, we pretty much mailed it in. We're looking forward to our vacations there come October 1st, and that's it. Or they're going to be a team that's going to play spoiler. Ellie De La Cruz, Jonathan India, they're going to be up for the task to play spoiler and maybe steal a game, maybe even 2 against the Braves. And then the Braves go to Florida to play the Marlins. And we know that the Braves beat up the Marlins left and right. So it can be very tricky for the Mets to be even or maybe even a game ahead a week from tomorrow. So that's why I'm hoping that they can be at least even. If they're a game behind, all right, fine. I guess I'm going to have to deal with it. They cannot be 2 games behind going to Atlanta. If they are, season's over. I said it then, and I'll say it now. And that's what it's going to be for the Mets and what it's going to take for them to get into the postseason, as they're right now deadlocked 81 and 68 there for the final spot in the National League wild card. And as we are on the National League wild card, that's it. Forget about the Cubs. They're 5 back with 12 to go. They are not going to make it. And even though people could think that, hey, they may have an outside shot, they are still mathematically alive, but they have 5 with 13 to play. That's a lot of ground to make up, and I don't care who you're playing. Unless you're playing the White Sox 13 out of those times, then we could arguably say that, hey, they have a shot, but that's not going to be the case. And then on the flip side in the American League is the AL East over. Now, we know that the Orioles and Yankees play one more time a week from tomorrow at the stadium, but the Orioles, they have just been floundering here. They have not played well here over the last few weeks. Now, they do have the Giants that they're going to host here, and the Giants, who knows? Are they going to be plucky? Are they going to be a little frisky to continue the losing woes here of the Orioles? And for them, they have just, I don't want to say they've run out of gas. And who knows? Maybe they'll be that top wild card in the American League, and then they'll win that series, and then they'll probably play the Yankees and then beat them in a 5-game series. The next thing you know, they're going to be represented, or one of the two teams representative in the ALCS. But right now, I don't like how the Orioles are playing and how I'll make out their week. They have the Giants that they're going to host, and then they also have the Tigers, which is going to be a huge series. And mind you, they lost 2 out of 3 in Detroit, where the Tigers are also trying to hang on with the AL wild card, and I'll get to them in a minute. But with those two teams coming to town before having to go on the road to close out their season, and their schedule is not easy. Obviously, the Yankees next week, and then they go to Minnesota, who could be fighting for their wild card lives, considering that the Tigers are trying to do the same as far as getting their way in through the back door and being the 6th seed in the American League. But I see the Yankees, now granted, they got to go to the West Coast to play Seattle, who are hanging in there. I got to give them all the credit in the world. They're hanging in as they're 2.5 games back in the wild card in their own right. And then they've got to go to Oakland. And Oakland, this is their final swan song. Because remember, they play in Sacramento the next few years, so their final homestand in that ballpark that they played forever is going to be against the Yankees. So you mean to tell me that they're not going to have big crowds? And for them, big crowds, I get it. Or what? 10,000? Who knows? Maybe they'll fill up the ballpark over the weekend knowing that the Yankees will come to town, and maybe they'll be inspired to do their best to play spoiler, maybe win 2 out of 3. And I know the Oriole fans and the Orioles are going to hope for that, because right now they cannot go into Yankee Stadium down 3 games. And even worse, if they're down more than 3 games, to me, even if they sweep the Yankees, I don't think they're going to win the AL East. And I'll go on record right now that the Yankees will win the AL East. Even having to fly out west to play Seattle, Oakland, not going to be easy games or easy series. And even with San Francisco and Detroit coming in for their final series at home for the 2024 year, I don't think it's going to be enough. I don't think the Orioles, maybe they'll slice a game, maybe 2, going into next week. If the Yankees revert to take their opposition for granted, all of a sudden the bats go cold. Aaron Judge now hit a couple home runs, so he awoke from that 16-game slumber of not hitting a home run. So who knows? Maybe he's now going to click on all cylinders. But let's see, because this Yankee team has been Jekyll and Hyde. Do they go into Hyde mode or Jekyll mode? That we'll see. But I think the Orioles, they're not going to win a division as of right this moment. So I'll go out on a limb to say that. And then as far as the American League wild card, it is a little intriguing right now. Because when you look at the Twins, and to me it's about the final spot, the Royals, they're good. They have a 2.5 game lead over the division rival Twins as of right this moment. And I believe the Twins do have a game in hand, so that's something to keep in mind. But with the Tigers, Mariners, both at 77 and 73, 3 in the loss, 2.5 back. And keep this in mind, the Red Sox, who are at 500, they're 4.5 back. But they play the Twins this coming weekend. So I can't cancel out the Red Sox right now, although they're going to have to run the table. And that's all there is to it. They cannot have any slip-ups here. They cannot look at what's gone on and think that, oh, we'll just have to wait till our series against the Twins and see what we could do. They could still be 4.5 back or 5 in a loss right now and sweep them. Then they still have to make up 2 games over the course of the last week of the season. And that's not going to be easy, considering that the Red Sox have been up and down and they just lost 3 out of 4 to the Yankees. So that's what you have there in the wild card. And let's take a look at the immediate schedule. And let's take a look overall. Let's just break it down, and then we'll go to the schedule here for the early part of the week. Twins, they'll have Cleveland for 4 in their building starting tonight. Not going to be easy. And then the Red Sox. So the Red Sox fan, they're breaking out the Guardian colors. If I said Indians, my apologies. They're breaking out the Guardian colors. They'll see what they could do against them before they have to go to Beantown over the weekend. Now, they do host Miami, and they play Baltimore to round out their year. Now, as far as the Red Sox, what do they need to do? They go to Tampa right now, which they'll play tomorrow. I think they have a day off today. So they'll have 3 in Tampa before hosting Minnesota. Then they play Toronto in Toronto before having Tampa in their building to close out the season. Not a tricky schedule for them, but it's not going to be easy, to say the least. Now, as far as Seattle, and I've been impressed by them, although we knew the division was going to be out of reach. But Seattle here, over the course of their final 12 games, they start off with a series against the Rangers. Excuse me, no, I got that wrong. They start off with Seattle. My apologies. Then they have the Rangers and Astros back-to-back before closing out against Oakland. So, not really easy when you think about it, although Texas in the middle, we'll see. And then to round it all off, let's see where the Tigers, and we talked about Detroit and how they played here. Now they go to Kansas City tonight. Now they're not going to be able to catch them as far as that second wild card spot in the American League. But you have Kansas City, then they go to Baltimore. I understand it's on the road, but they did win 2 out of 3 against them this past weekend. And then they host Tampa and Chicago. So if they can get out of this week, preferably 5-1, but all right, let's say they go 4-2. Now, we'll have to wait and see how this shapes up. But if they win these next 2 series, and having both Tampa and Chicago, White Sox come into their building, they could sneak it through the back door. And Minnesota, like I said, their schedule's a little bit dicey. Very intriguing. I understand the Tigers, they're not pushing the needle when it comes to the baseball landscape, or even the Twins, maybe even the Red Sox for that matter. Some of these teams, Seattle. I get it. But it's right there. And at least you have some drama heading into the final week of this baseball season. So just something to keep in mind. And some news and notes real quick from baseball. I know the big one is Tyler Glasnow. Unlikely that he may pitch the remainder of this year, which will be a death knell, I think, come October for this Dodger team. Because now you're going to hope that Yoshinobu Yamamoto is going to be 100% raring to go and is going to be as advertised coming into this year. And, of course, he's had his moments, including that 4-inning start there the other day. And I believe he's probably going to pitch tonight. Or if he didn't pitch yesterday, I should have looked at to see where Yamamoto is going to pitch here. But how I look at it is this. If you're the Dodgers and all you're going to have is Jack Flaherty, if you're praying for Clayton Kershaw to come back, I mean, that's another stretch. And I get it. They've been a mass unit there with their rotation. So many players or pitchers have been down for the count. Understood. But if you're not going to have Glasnow, I'm not trying to make him out to be Bob Gibson. But if you're not going to have him in the lineup, that is going to be, or in the rotation, that's going to be huge. Because who else are you going to expect here? I mean, Walker Buehler walked 5 yesterday, and he pitched okay. But is Buehler going to come through now in October after having a very shaky comeback from Tommy John and other injuries that he suffered? I don't know. It is not looking good for the Dodgers, if you ask me. And with Glasnow not coming back, at least the likelihood of him not coming back is going to be, I think, a true test to whether or not the Dodgers are going to get back to a World Series and win it. So I'll have to monitor that as we move it along here over the course of the final 2 weeks of the season. All right, now I've eclipsed an hour. I know a lot of football talk to get us going, but let me wrap up on a couple of things before I say goodbye. NHL training camp opens up on Thursday. I understand people are like, who cares? NHL, it's way off my radar. I bring it up for a couple of reasons. One, training camp, so the season will ramp up shortly. Number 2, big loss there for the Devils. Luke Hughes, defenseman, who suffered an injury during training, and a shoulder injury at that, out 6 for 8 weeks. He's the brother of Jack Hughes, the number 1 pick there of a few years back. So without having Luke Hughes in the lineup to at least start the year, and remember, they're going to start in that international series in Prague in Czech Republic against the Sabres. I believe that's going to be October the 4th, where the season, I believe, the curtain raises on that Tuesday the 8th. So just keep that in mind. No Luke Hughes. Adam Larsson re-ups with the Seattle Kraken, 4 years. He was actually going into a walk year, but they decided to re-up 4 years, $21 million. So just have to throw that in there in the mix. And then very sad news regarding a former tough guy who didn't really have a long stay in the NHL, but he had one of the more memorable fights that you'll ever see in a regular season, where he was a member of the Capitals against P.J. Stock, who was a Ranger, I believe, prospect, farmhand once upon a time, and then went to Boston. Very short in stature. I believe P.J. Stock was, 5'9"? And had arguably one of the top 10 fights in the regular season of all time. And you have to include the postseason as well, where Stephen Peat, P.J. Stock had a toe-to-toe, just all-out bout. One that has still remembered to this day, and that fight goes back 20-some-odd years. And for Stephen Peat, who had a very short stay in the NHL, had some memorable fights, that being the, bar none, the best fight of them all, died after being struck by a car outside of Vancouver, where I believe he lived in British Columbia, and suffered injuries, didn't make it, actually died, I believe, last Thursday. It was official. There were a lot of rumors whether or not he had died earlier or was still trying to come out of it, considering this accident. And it's just tragic when you think about what happened with the Gaudreau brothers, Johnny and Matthew, and they were bicycling. Now, I don't know, in the case of Stephen Peat, was he out there jogging? Because I believe he was struck around 4:30 in the morning. So I don't know if he was out on just a morning walk, or maybe he was out there jogging. Who knows? But struck, killed, not instantly, but later on, as we find out. Another terrible story that just hits the NHL. Thoughts, prayers, condolences go out to the Peat family, the Capitals. Was also a member of the Hurricanes, but didn't really play for Carolina. And throughout the entire league, just a terrible story there regarding the former tough guy who died at the age of 44. And then lastly, double dip here, boxing and UFC. Canelo, no shock there. He unanimously beats Edgar Berlanga, the young kid out of Brooklyn who had 22 wins, 17 knockouts. But who did he fight throughout the course of his career? Obviously, I couldn't pick one out of a lineup. But dominated, unanimous. And what more can you say? Another title defense for the super middleweight as he does so. And Canelo, he can talk all he wants. I beat young kids, I beat old guys, whatever. All right, but we understand he's a legendary fighter, etc. But to me, I just bring it up only because I mentioned it on Thursday's podcast, and it wasn't as if it was a split decision or, wow, Canelo got knocked down, or was really Berlanga giving him a run for his money. Certainly not the case, as Alvarez coasts to another title defense victory. And then in UFC, which I knew that there was a little bit of a lead into over the weekend in this bantamweight title between Merab Dvalishvili, he had, or I'm mispronouncing that, Dvalishvili, I guess that's how you pronounce it. You know me with names, people, as I always say. He had a decisive win in his own right, beating Sean O'Malley to capture the title. I don't know if he was defending that title or not, but I just thought to bring that up here just to round out the fighting aspect between boxing and UFC. That'll do it, my good people. Another episode in the books. Just 2 away now from 500. Many thanks for being a part of this journey. And please, to your family, friends, foes, or enemies, or frenemies, I should say, if they don't know about the podcast, who love sports, like sports, casual sports fan, diehard rabid, please share it with them. I would sincerely appreciate it. As always, Apple, Spotify, jreels.com, the YouTube channel at jreels. Just pass it along to them. Take a screenshot. Do whatever it takes, people. Because as you know, I'm a full-time content creator doing this from the love, trying to generate income in the process, as I've been doing this for now 7+ months. Think about that, people. So please, pass that along to those who may be interested. As far as wanting to get in touch with me, question, comment, suggestion, you can do so the following. On Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, the J-Reels Podcast. Twitter, JReels1, just a number. The old-fashioned way, the J-Reels Podcast at gmail.com. Please, hit me up. I'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys and gals, because whether you do or do not know, this is what I love to do, people. It's in the blood. It's in the DNA. Talking sports since birth about anything and everything that happens. And this is a little bit over an hour, but where else are you going to get this, people? Name another podcast that's going to span the entire sports landscape. to do it with nothing but fire, passion, energy, fury, with my thoughts, opinions, critiques, praise, analysis, feelings on anything and everything that happens on the world of the diamond, ice, gridiron, hardwood, golf course, racetrack, tennis court, boxing ring, octagon, you name it. From my lips to your ears, from my heart to your soul, from where I am to wherever you are, the J Reels podcast always comes correct, direct, and in full effect. From the South Bronx, the South Beach, the South Central, the South Pacific, and all points beyond, peace, love, and God bless everybody. And until next time on the J Reels podcast, on the flip, baby.